Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Alison McKenna. I'm Consultant Clinical Psychologist and Clinical Lead in Southeastern Trust's Regional Trauma Network. And with me today I have Orla Connolly, Trauma-Informed Practice Implementation Manager in Safeguarding Board Northern Ireland, and Karen Morgan, Health and Wellbeing Case Manager from the Victims and Survivors Service. Thank you for completing this poll on arrival. We're keen to know how far and wide we're reaching, so we're very grateful to you for completing this. This is the fourth in our series of 6 Lunch and Learns, so we have 2 more after today. The 2 focus areas of the SBNI's Trauma-Informed Organisational Toolkit being covered today are resourcing and leadership. You can access all of the Lunch and Learns that are to come via the same link that you used today, the same link and passcode. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the playlist on YouTube after today. Your mics have been deactivated, but we will take questions at the end. With it being a 40-minute Lunch and Learn, it can only be a taster of a topic, but we do have a webinar series that is also running, so you will find that we will have more in-depth coverage of particular topics on the webinar series. If you would like to receive a copy of the slides, a link to the recording, a certificate for 1 hour CPD and any other resources we may have, please enter your details in the window which is appearing on your screen now. We need your name and your email. Please note that we cannot send you the resources without both. And unfortunately, we are only permitted to issue certificates to those who entered their details by 1:10 We value your feedback, so please answer the polls that will come up at various intervals. Mainly they're tick box, so it shouldn't take very long. The one at the very end is a little bit more lengthier and just asks for the types of topics you might like covered in the future. One of our team is monitoring the chat and we will answer your questions towards the end. Today's session, like all the other Lunch and Learn sessions, has been co-designed and co-delivered by Health and Social Care and the Victims and Survivors Service. And in this case, this series has been a collaboration also with Safeguarding Board Northern Ireland, whose trauma-informed organisational toolkit we're showcasing. Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to pass over now to Orla and Karen.
Thank you very much, Alison. Hi, everybody. So I'm one of 4 implementation managers who sit within the Trauma-Informed Practice team, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come and listen to myself and Karen today. As Alison said, today is the 4th session of 6 taster sessions, which really focus on the various aspects to becoming a trauma-informed organisation. And what you'll see on this next slide is really just a reminder how the toolkit provides a framework or a pathway, which is really intended to help organisations reflect on their current practices, what's going well, and identify further areas for development. So it's a model really to support you to take a trauma-informed lens to your work. But it's really important that we recognise that this is one which complements and links to existing priorities and developments. So in terms of thinking about what we're going to talk about today, we're going to provide a brief overview of 2 focus areas. We don't expect everyone to look at all areas at once, and picking 1 or 2 areas and we recognise that really extended periods for implementation are required. So we also emphasise that small steps in the journey can make a big difference. And you'll see from this summary infographic, it's about how we infuse the principles into kind of everything we do. People who have experienced trauma have had experiences where they did not feel safe, and healing and recovery is based on experiences that contradict that. And you'll see there are relationships at the core, and how do we embed these principle-based culture of awareness and sensitivity. So when this next slide really we're going to talk about this aspect of resourcing. And resourcing is about giving our staff, including our volunteers, the time and the sense of permission to really enhance their knowledge and confidence of the complex area of trauma and what it means to be a trauma-informed organisation. So if we have our staff, our leaders and our champions, and they're not allocated the time to focus on this work, or they don't have permission to focus on this work, they can become quickly overwhelmed. So we want to think about the importance of supporting the regulation of our staff, so they will be able to support those they encounter. And we've talked before in our workforce wellbeing session about how stressed people can find it difficult to regulate stressed people. So it's also about those who come to our buildings, what we can do to maximise that warm welcome and promote that sense of safety. And you'll see there, we need to give people who are closest to the issues kind of, the time, the permission, the skills and the resources to address them. And it's about that whole systems approach as well. So on this next slide, we've touched on this at previous sessions. We asked Queen's University to look at what does the international evidence say, and what are our organisations across Northern Ireland saying, and what are they saying specifically about finance and resourcing. So what they were saying was, as a reminder, those settings, those healthcare settings that implemented a trauma-informed approach have had better access to mental health services, a reduction in healthcare costs, and a significant decrease in the use of seclusion and restraint. They're just some of the enablers that I pulled out, but you can look at the full report and you'll see, lots of details in terms of those barriers and enablers. But the importance of us also focusing on longer term outcomes. So when we're thinking about resourcing, we're not just thinking about the short term benefit, we're thinking about the longer term savings associated with earlier and more targeted intervention. So the research was very clear that financing and that resourcing is a key component of trauma-informed approach implementation. And if we have insufficient budgets, this was seen as a central, kind of barrier to implementation. The report from Queen's was also saying that those organisations who invested in a trauma-informed lead or team found that progress was quicker, more significant and more inclusive. They were also talking about how investing in the job, a post, a team, that steering group, this is something that's very symbolic within the organisation and is key to progressing, the implementation of a trauma-informed approach within that organisation. The research was also talking about the need to manage inadequate resourcing and short-term funding in the community and voluntary sectors, in particular this year-on-year funding. And also they talked about the absence of trauma-informed commissioning and needing to address this. So on this next slide, it's really just a brief summary. So as well as the Queen's University Belfast research, we have also asked University of Ulster to conduct a review of some external pilots, which actually Karen was part of and will talk to shortly, which were funded by the SBNI. And while this report hasn't been released as yet, the researchers did provide a preview of the finding and recommendations at the regional conference. So they were highlighting the feedback from organisations who had participated in an external assessment of a process to review, develop and track where they're at in terms of becoming a trauma-informed organisation. So this toolkit is an internal assessment. This was a report in relation to feedback from organisations who had engaged in an external assessment. And you'll see there some of the quotes from this kind of service evaluation, but also it was talking about in terms of resourcing that we need to recognise and respond to the distinct needs of organisations of different sizes and structures. We need to provide opportunities for connection, and we need to develop a regional peer network for ongoing collaboration. And I think this is important because it's thinking about, we don't want individuals or organizations doing this on their own. We want people to be able to learn from each other and to hear what some of the barriers, what some of the challenges are in relation to implementing a trauma-informed approach. And one of the key things in both these pieces of research was really talking about this importance of valuing relationships as an outcome, and that we need leadership to acknowledge this essential relational element of the work, and how people need to have a genuine permission to engage in this. So we know that when people have experienced trauma, they grew up perhaps no one noticing their distress, people were not trustworthy, they did not feel safe. The importance of this relational approach is about having experiences that contradict this. And this was something that was a key message in terms of this resourcing piece in both pieces of research. So how do we connect the system to itself? Collaboration is key. How do we have this whole system approach with us all working together? So just to finish that brief overview of thinking about broadening our understanding of resourcing, it's really, this extract from the toolkit on page 78 is really that questionnaire and asking you to review within your team, service or organisation. Do you have the time for training at the right level? Do you have the provision of support? Do you have the resource to improve your physical environments and for routine feedback mechanisms? So hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of this focus area of when we're talking about resourcing, these are the kinds of things that we're inviting team services and organisations to think about. If we move on now to thinking about our next area, I know you're going to complete a poll there, and I'll just tell you while you're doing this, what we're going to be talking about now is this idea of then leadership, and resourcing is closely linked to leadership. And one of the things that Queen's University Belfast were saying in their report was that we don't have a rolling trauma-informed leadership programme here. The SBNI did have one a number of years back called Be the Change, but that was one of the recommendations. How do we support organisations and leadership to understand what does it mean to be a trauma-informed organisation? What is a trauma-informed approach? So as we move on here to the next slide, the Queen's research was clearly saying that if we want to become a trauma-informed organisation, any initiative, we want it to be long lasting, it has to be supported at the highest level of the organisation. We have to have these implementation structures. We have to have someone who is leading on this, the identified point of responsibility. The research also talked about the momentum being generated from individual trauma-informed champions. And if we can have a champion within a position of authority, with a dedicated role of instilling those trauma-informed principles and practices into the organisation, this is something that will be really important in all our teams. The research talked about the qualities of those effective leaders. There were people who were passionate, who were committed, who were empathetic, active, and visionary. And also that leadership buy-in is critical for what we talked about, that longer term sustainability. So if we, you have the limitations of when knowledge is located in one individual who may move on. So this is really that important message about cascading this and connecting those people together, connecting those trauma-informed champions. So the next slide talks here just about that implementation guidance. And When we want to really demonstrate that we have a genuine investment in a trauma-informed approach, we have to show transparency within the organisation in terms of the operations and decisions. We want this regular open communication. We want people with trauma histories being involved in planning, governance and leadership. And when we're thinking about trauma-informed leadership, we want leaders to model within the organisation and encourage everyone at all levels, all of us, to constructively challenge and hold one another to account when actions don't align with a trauma-informed approach. And this next slide just asks the question, what does trauma-informed leadership look and feel like? And Trauma Informed Oregon had done, a questionnaire. And this is some of the interpersonal interactions and the professional behaviours you'll see here that were noted when they talked about what does a trauma-informed leadership look and feel like. And you'll see words there like authentic, approachable, non-judgmental, really thinking about, the tone of people's voice, being calm, avoiding reactive responses, giving plenty of notice for requests, and this fundamental, concept of thinking about the sense of safety. And what's important is that greeting people with a smile was actually one of the most common responses when staff were asked, describe a trauma-informed leader. And I think this just reminds us it's the simple things that matter, and bringing those aspects to consciousness. How do we really work on the culture and climate of our organisations and adhere to those principles? So the next slide, you'll see this thinking about this culture and climate. It's about how do we establish safety for our staff and those who come to our services. And the importance of the leader role, modelling these qualities, cannot be overstated. So you'll see there, it's all about connection takes place when people, kind of often unconsciously know that a person is safe, reliable and trustworthy. And you'll see on the next slide this concept of organisational listening. Everyone doesn't have to have all the answers, but we need leaders who keep in touch with the reality of the work. We need those feedback loops. We need the people who are closest to the issues having the opportunity to feel heard and listened to. And we always remember that being understood by someone is going to reduce stress at that physiological level in your body. So for leadership, we're thinking about that power of gesture and response, being curious about someone's view, and that openness to listen is really going to demonstrate that courageous leadership. So just as I'm coming to the end, I also just want to say leadership is not just about that individual leadership. We need to think about a collective leadership approach. And many of you will be familiar with this when we think about the 4 aspects of collective leadership. So we're thinking about compassionate leadership, interdependent, shared leadership, and really how leadership is the responsibility of us all. And you'll see there from that slide the many benefits when we really adopt this perspective of leadership and all the components of that. So in summary, this next slide is really saying this process of embedding a trauma-informed approach is about change happening one conversation at a time. It's about connecting our champions, our implementation structures, our implementation plan. Do we have an explicit commitment? And, some organizations may have an explicit commitment to becoming a trauma-informed organization in their corporate plan. As we've said in previous webinars, we're delighted it's went into the draft program for government and hopefully, will remain there. So it's this message of no matter where we are, if you are at, that green bit at the start, change happens one conversation at a time. This is a journey. And these next 2 slides, I'm not going to talk to them because we're going to hear from Karen about implementation in action and what VSS did in terms of their early champions, their natural leaders, connecting people who can oversee the implementation of this. And you'll see on the next slide, it's just a brief mention of when we have an implementation team. It's about steering the implementation, making sure our selection processes are transparent. How do we have representation from every level in our organization's hierarchy? So if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. I'm not going to talk to this next slide, but just to say there are lots of resources and examples within the toolkit. You feel free to get in touch with us as implementation managers. You'll see that one example on the next slide of the Southern Trust, where they had an implementation. You had their steering group. They identified short-term and long-term priorities. You can take a look at this on page 53 of the toolkit. And that final slide there on leadership is really on page 62 of the toolkit. And again, this is a questionnaire and a self-assessment to really invite you to think about where are you at in your team, in your organization, in your service, in terms of thinking about to what extent is trauma-informed leadership embedded within your organization. So I'll hand over to Karen now, but hopefully that just gives you just a little bit of background of some things that we invite people to think about when we're thinking about trauma-informed leadership and trauma-informed resourcing. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Orla, and thanks everybody for attending today. So just to give you a background, VSS were successful in achieving the silver trauma-informed quality mark through one small thing back in June. So I just want to give you a few practical examples of how we achieved that in terms of leadership and resourcing. Thank you. So leadership is key. You really need the support of your board and your senior management, or it's going to be near impossible. And our VSS board understood the values of trauma-informed practice and how these underpin the values, mission and vision of the service and the 10 domains within the service's approach. Again, you can't do it without the support of your senior management team, but you also need a trauma-informed leader to drive the implementation process forward and inspire the trauma-informed working group. You need that leadership to give commitment to prioritise trauma-informed care within your organisation, including engaging in level 1 and level 2 trauma awareness training for all the staff, as well as the senior management and the board. Next slide, please, Alison. So the first thing we did was we identified trauma-informed champions working group, and we aimed to promote awareness of trauma among the staff and board members to enhance the competency among staff and leadership, especially those staff that aren't frontline facing, that aren't health and wellbeing, that are possibly in the corporate end of the organisation or finance, and help them understand their role in trauma-informed care and what it would mean to them. It's important that staff feel informed about the trauma-informed care effort, and much of that information comes from the trauma-informed working group. So we identified 18 trauma champions working across the service in all levels, across the organisation, with varying roles, ranging from administrative officers to head of health and wellbeing services. Next slide, please. So how we did that, it was important to establish a group of individuals who could connect to the rest of the organisation and help cascade that trauma-informed training and information and infusing that across the organisation. So we sent out an expression of interest to all the staff. It's important that the working group represents staff from all departments and at all levels, so there's no hierarchy. It's also important that it includes the individuals with the ability and the authority to make change, and that the power is balanced with the group, ensuring that too much power doesn't rest with a few people, yet including individuals who have the skills necessary to confront other power structures within the organisation, but also that can propel that trauma-informed implementation forward. Decisions are made by consensus voting. The working group is chaired by the head of health and wellbeing and the human resources manager, and members are invited to commit to the working group for 12 months. Now, interestingly enough, we're just putting out again for expressions of interest for new staff. and most of the working group have decided to still stay. The leadership champions, they're tasked with collating and organising evidence and leading the trauma-informed implementation plan and actions. Next slide, please. Okay, so staff voice is prioritised with BSS strategic plan and development. It's important that psychological safety is promoted and that we give the working group, as well as all staff in the organisation, the ability to speak up with ideas, questions, concerns, without any negative social or professional consequences. Staff are encouraged to share their ideas and enhance creativity within staff participation, including surveys, discussions, post-it notes during staff planning days to enhance anonymity. And again, that's to promote psychological safety. And this feedback is collected and used to make modifications as needed and choose opportunities for improvement. So big big part of the working group tasks will be prioritising and recommending opportunities for trauma-informed care, including but not limited to reviewing policies, practices and the environment with a trauma-informed lens, and then making changes to meet the trauma-informed principles. Establishing a system of communicating the progress to the rest of the organisation, and engaging all staff in level 1 and level 2 trauma awareness training and getting feedback as well. Next slide, please. So again, if you're thinking about how you can begin this process, your organisational review of trauma-informed practice, it doesn't need to be external. It doesn't need to come from Trauma-Informed Oregon or one small thing. You have the toolkit there. When we were doing this toolkit didn't exist, so you can use that toolkit as a benchmark to see where you are, to assess your readiness for trauma-informed implementation. And it also might shine a light on what you're doing well and show that, you know, don't assume that you're not already doing things brilliantly. This will also encourage your trauma-informed champions and serve to inspire and motivate your staff. Next slide, please. So part of what we did was put in clinical and reflective supervision clinical supervision for the health and wellbeing staff, the front line, and reflective for the rest of the organisation. There is a cost to this, so if you don't have the financial resources, ways that you can help promote that reflective practice. There's reflective questions that you can ask your members to support their health and wellbeing. Trauma-Informed Oregon is a great resource and it's free, and they have plenty of guidance on reflective practice. The reason we're doing reflective practice is to prevent employees from experiencing compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma. We do both formal and informal methods of supervision. It helps staff reflect on their health and wellbeing and their development in trauma-informed working, but also their responses to working with the people that we serve. And then we review this with anonymous surveys, and a recent annual survey indicated the staff feel safe discussing issues in supervision and feel valued and appreciated. Next slide, please. So we also have a workforce wellness group, and that was established back in 2018, which was to promote compassionate leadership and workforce wellness opportunities. And it served us well, especially whenever we all had to move to working remotely, basically overnight because of COVID-19, and people were feeling isolated, working remotely with the uncertainty of the world at the time and all the challenges that were there as well. So the Workforce Wellness Working Group supports staff to promote staff resilience, gives ideas for self-care, promotes connection, and it's underpinned by the Take 5 Steps to Wellbeing. It complements the work of the trauma-informed champions. Workforce wellness is a big component within trauma-informed care, so it complements recommends both. It helps to promote opportunities of self-care and help the staff regulate. Okay, next slide, please. So another big part of the trauma-informed implementation was workforce training schedule. It needs to be flexible and personalized. There are some things that we expect all our staff to do, but then there's other opportunities. We use both internal and external training activities. We're open to any training which will enhance the individual's knowledge and improve their personal and professional effectiveness. As I said before, we offer level 1 ACE awareness and level 2 developing trauma sensitive practice training as part of our induction for all staff. We also have engaged in train the trainer, so we're able to deliver that in-house. Wave trauma training is amazing and it's available to all of our staff, and they range from afternoon sessions, all-day sessions, or 4-week courses, right up until the master's level in trauma studies as well through the University College in Cork. We have quarterly led staff trauma-informed care discussion. The last, well, I suppose one of the initial ones was just introducing the trauma-informed principles to the team and across the organisation and getting them to see where they were employing or promoting those principles within their day-to-day duties across different teams as well. So health and wellbeing, finance, corporate programs, and just making it sort of understandable and help break down those barriers. It's incorporating practice into daily routine and providing opportunities for growth. Next slide, please. So again, as Orla says, lots of things can happen that don't require additional finances. There's the research that's available. There's all the publications on SBNI website. There's their toolkit. I really can't recommend that enough. Then there's the SBNI team. There's One Small Thing. There's Trauma Informed Oregon. There's Scottish Toolkit. There's Blue Knot Foundation. There's Dr. Karen Treisman's Creating Trauma Informed Organisation Toolkit as well, which has been very helpful. And lean on other organisations who have successfully implemented the trauma-informed approaches. In the previous slides, Orla has given different case studies. When we think about improving the culture and climate and how we do our business every day throughout those behaviours and interactions, so those are all the resources that the VSS have used, including the safeguarding team and anybody that would talk to me for 5 minutes about this. Next slide, please. So if you can just take a wee second and complete that poll. Thank you. Next slide, please. So is it worth the effort? And it is effort. You're asking people to do extra tasks in addition to their normal job, but it is so worth it, because it enhances the professionalism of the organization. It will lead to trust. It will lead to collaboration. It will just it just raises the standard. What we found was there were a lot more trauma-informed opportunities, and it opened other doors. It promoted staff morale. We all had a shared goal where everybody contributed meaningfully. The tasks of the working group were shared out equally, and it was agreed. So everybody had their own part to play, but they were all working together. It also established strong positive connections with other trauma-informed professionals and inspirational leaders. We've been visited from quite a few really interesting professionals. It offers trust and reassurance to those who benefit from your service. And yeah, it has that positive effect, not only in your professional life, but also your personal life. You see the world under a different lens if you're doing it properly. under a more positive lens, and a compassionate lens. And just the key takeaways: the collective leadership and collaboration, the continuous improvement and valuation. Just keep looking at where we're at, okay, where we need to go. You cannot do it without your leadership champions. It takes time. It won't happen overnight, but it's totally achievable. That organizational commitment top down is essential as well. You need that commitment and support from your board and from your directors and from your senior management team. But the connection that will happen and the cohesion is so worth it. Give yourself a realistic time frame. It's not impossible, but it's one step at a time. We were lucky in the sense where we already had a lot of things established, like the workforce wellness, like supervision. So, you know, we were in a good position. And take your time to do it. Speak to people that have been through the process. What would they do differently? Trauma-informed approach. It's everybody's business, and be the change that you want to see in the world. Okay, thank you. And I'll just hand you back over to Orla. And if you could just complete this poll, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. I think it's always great to see of what it looks like in practice, and you know, your willingness to share kind of your journey is always really appreciated with others. So I suppose what I just want to finish with just this message: look, we can all play a part. You know, we can promote and set a trauma-informed culture. Part of this is bringing this language, you know, into our day-to-day, you know, behaviors and interactions, and that will support trauma-informed change to happen. We can align recommendations and work we're doing with the trauma-informed principles. Yes, we have to acknowledge the complexity. We have to compassionately listen to our own and our service, you know, our staff service user experience, but we have to really, you know, we notice and actively appreciate, you know, the activities and the journey, for example, VSS have been on. Yes, there are parts of the system that are not letting us operate in a trauma-informed way, and we have to acknowledge and recognize system pressures, but equally supporting learning, having those reflective spaces, building that culture of openness and support, you know, that shared vision that we talk about, building those relationships, connecting the system to itself. You know, you and I are the people, you know, the Maxine's Mary, you know, the people who do the work, do the change. So really, you know, we certainly want to thank, you know, the Regional Trauma Network for the opportunity to partner really in providing an overview, you know, in these sessions of what it means to be a trauma-informed organisation. And the final slide there is just really some of the resources that we've talked about, where you can download the toolkit, the checklist, take a look at the websites if you want to get in touch with myself or any of the other implementation managers. We're happy to support any team, any organisation or service. The latest research you will see there in terms of the Queen's University prevalence study, the online training brochure. So the UU research, when it's published, will be via that link as well. So I suppose it's just to say, you know, thank you very much. Hopefully that whistle stop tour give people some ideas to think about, and certainly we're happy to take any questions. So thank you very much.